There is a silence that precedes certain months. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of something held just beneath the surface. And January has long been that kind of month. A hinge between what was and what will be. A threshold written not only in calendars, but in the texture of collective memory. And if you trace the pattern backward through history, you will find that January is not simply the first month of a year, but often the month in which decisions already made in shadow are forced into light. When treaties are signed that redraw borders. When revolutions declare themselves. When the architectures of power either consolidate or fracture. And there is something about the cold clarity of January, the way it strips away the residual optimism of December and confronts us with unadorned reality, that makes it a month of revelation whether we are ready or not. And so, when two figures separated by 5 centuries, by culture, by language, by method, both gesture toward January 2026 as a moment of profound and unsettling disclosure, it is worth pausing not to embrace certainty, but to examine the pattern, because patterns are what remain when noise is filtered. And the pattern here is not one of apocalypse, but of unveiling, not destruction, but recognition, the kind of recognition that changes everything, not because the world ends, but because the world as it was understood can no longer be sustained. And this is where Vanga and Nostradamus enter the picture, not as prophets demanding belief, but as witnesses to something they saw or sensed in the architecture of time. Vanga, the blind mystic of Bulgaria, who spent decades in a small house on the edge of the Kotsu Mountains, speaking in fragmented images to those who came seeking answers. Her visions, unfiltered by education or doctrine, raw impressions of futures she could not see but somehow felt. And Nostradamus, the French physician and astrologer who encoded his visions in quatrains designed to survive censorship, writing in a time when prophecy could mean execution, constructing puzzles that would only make sense to those living through the events he described. And the fact that these two minds, so different in their contexts and constraints, both point toward a revelation in January 2026, is not proof of anything supernatural, but it is a data point, a convergence that resists easy dismissal. And if you are someone who does not immediately reject the possibility that human consciousness might occasionally perceive patterns beyond the visible, if you are willing to entertain the idea that intuition is a form of pattern recognition operating on signals we have not yet learned to measure, then you might consider that what Vanga and Nostradamus were tracking was not a specific event, but a probability wave, a moment when the conditions for disclosure reach a critical threshold, when the veil between what is known and what is suspected becomes so thin that it can no longer hold. And the question then becomes not whether January 2026 will bring revelation, but what kind of revelation it might be, and whether humanity is prepared to integrate what it reveals, because revelation is not simply the exposure of hidden information, it is the collapse of the framework that allowed that information to remain hidden. It is the moment when institutions built on selective truth can no longer sustain the illusion of completeness, when the distance between official narrative and lived reality becomes unignorable. And this is why the warnings attributed to Vanga and Nostradamus should be read not as predictions of a singular event, but as descriptions of a threshold condition, a state in which multiple revealing forces converge. And if you are watching this, if you have followed the thought this far, it is likely because you have felt something shifting, a subtle wrongness in the air. A sense that the explanations you have been given no longer fully account for what you observe, and that instinct, that quiet suspicion, is worth honoring, because it may be the early edge of the very pattern these figures were describing. So before we go further, understand that this is not a call to panic, but an invitation to observe, to pay attention to the spaces where narrative falters, to notice what is being revealed incrementally, and to prepare not with fear but with clarity, because those who approach revelation with grounded awareness rather than reactive terror are the ones who will be able to navigate what follows. And now we must turn to the nature of prophetic language itself, because, without understanding how these visions operate, we risk misreading them entirely. Prophecy does not work like a news report. It does not provide dates and locations in the way we might prefer. Instead, it compresses complex social and psychological dynamics into symbolic images, metaphors that carry multiple meanings simultaneously. And this is not evasion but necessity, because the future is not a fixed script, but a field of probabilities shaped by human choice, and what a prophet perceives is not a guaranteed outcome, but a trajectory, a direction in which forces are moving unless something intervenes to alter the path. And so, when we speak of January 2026 as a moment of revelation, we are not speaking of a date circled in red on some cosmic calendar, but of a window, a period in which the conditions for disclosure are maximally aligned, when the psychological readiness of the collective, the structural instability of institutions, and the acceleration of information flow all converge to create a moment in which secrets can no longer be kept, and this is the framework within which we must interpret the warnings, not as literal prophecies but as symbolic maps of pressure points, places where the veil is already thin and growing thinner. And one of the images that recurs in the fragments associated with Baba Vanga is the image of a sky that opens, not in the sense of a physical rupture, but in the sense of something concealed becoming suddenly visible, as if a layer of reality that was always there but hidden from view is suddenly made apparent. And there are multiple ways to read this. One interpretation is that it refers to the disclosure of information, the release of documents or testimonies that confirm what many have long suspected but could not prove. Another interpretation is that it points to a shift in collective perception, a moment when a critical mass of people simultaneously recognize a pattern they had been trained not to see. And a third, more unsettling interpretation is that it describes a confrontation with non-human intelligence, not necessarily extraterrestrial, but something that has been operating in parallel to human civilization, observing, influencing, and now choosing to make itself known. And, while these interpretations may seem wildly different, they share a common structure. They all describe the collapse of a boundary, the failure of a mechanism that kept certain truths quarantined, and psychologically this kind of collapse is far more destabilizing than any physical disaster, because it undermines the very categories through which we make sense of reality. It forces a renegotiation of what is possible, what is real, and what we have been deceived about, either by others or by ourselves. And this is where the psychological dimension of revelation becomes critical, because the revelation itself is only half the story. The other half is how individuals and societies respond to the revelation, whether they integrate the new information or fragment under its weight, whether they adapt or collapse. And history shows us that the greatest upheavals are not caused by external threats but by internal contradictions finally surfacing, by the moment when a society can no longer sustain the gap between its stated values and its actual practices. And if January 2026 marks such a moment, it will be because the gap has become unbridgeable, because the mechanisms of distraction and denial that have kept the contradiction manageable are no longer sufficient. And this brings us to another layer of the warnings, the sense that revelation is not something imposed from outside but something already present, already pressing against the surface, waiting only for the right conditions to break through. Nostradamus in his quatrains often used the imagery of veils and shadows, of things hidden in plain sight that would be revealed when the alignment was correct. And while his language is notoriously opaque, there is a quatrain that some interpreters have linked to the winter of 2026. A quatrain that speaks of a great trembling in the month of cold beginnings, when what was thought buried rises to the eye of the world. And again, this is symbolic, not literal, but the symbolism points toward exposure, toward the surfacing of something submerged. And if we map this onto the current global landscape, we see multiple candidates for what might be revealed. There are questions about the origins of technologies that seem to have advanced far beyond what public research should allow. There are questions about geopolitical structures that operate outside the frameworks of democratic accountability. There are questions about environmental collapse and whether the full extent of ecological damage has been accurately reported. There are questions about the nature of consciousness itself, and whether the materialist paradigm that has dominated science for centuries is beginning to crack under the weight of evidence it cannot explain. And any one of these revelations would be profound. But the truly destabilizing scenario is not the revelation of one secret, but the revelation of a system of secrets. The recognition that the discrepancies are not isolated anomalies, but features of a coordinated structure. And this is where the warnings from Baba Vanga and Nostradamus converge most clearly. Both suggest not a single event but a cascade, a domino effect, in which one disclosure triggers another, in which the breaking of one seal weakens all the others. And the timing matters because timing is about readiness, about whether the collective consciousness is prepared to absorb the shock without shattering, and there are signs that this readiness is building, not in the form of explicit preparation, but in the form of widespread disillusionment with authority, a growing recognition that official narratives are incomplete at best and manipulative at worst. And this disillusionment, while painful, is actually a precondition for revelation, because it means that people are psychologically primed to consider alternatives. They have already begun the work of questioning, and so the revelation, when it comes, will not be entirely shocking. It will feel more like confirmation, like the final piece of a puzzle that many were already assembling in private. And this is important because it suggests that January 2026 is not an arbitrary date imposed by prophecy, but a date that emerges from the internal logic of the system itself, a point at which the pressure of withheld truth exceeds the capacity of the structures designed to contain it. And if this sounds abstract, consider the mechanics of how information is controlled. Information is not simply hidden. It is managed. It is released in controlled doses. It is framed in ways that minimize disruption. And this management requires energy. It requires coordination. It requires that the people doing the managing believe in the necessity of the secret. And what we are seeing now, across multiple domains, is a breakdown in that coordination. Whistleblowers are emerging not because they suddenly developed a conscience, but because they no longer believe the system they were protecting is worth protecting. Leaks are increasing not because security has weakened, but because the psychological investment in secrecy has weakened. And this is the kind of slow-motion collapse that precedes revelation, not a dramatic breach, but a gradual erosion, 1,000 small betrayals of the official story. And by January 2026, this erosion may reach a tipping point. The point at which the narrative infrastructure simply fails, and when narrative infrastructure fails, the result is not chaos but clarity, uncomfortable clarity. The kind of clarity that forces people to confront what they have been avoiding. And this is where the human cost becomes visible. Because revelation is not a neutral to event. It has psychological consequences. It disrupts identity. It shatters belief systems that people have built their lives around. It calls into question not just what they thought they knew, but who they thought they were. And for some people this will be liberating, the relief of finally seeing clearly. But for others, it will be devastating, the collapse of meaning, the sense that everything they trusted was a lie. And societies are not good at holding this kind of rupture. They tend to polarize. Some people retreating into denial and doubling down on the old narrative, others swinging into paranoia and seeing conspiracy in everything. And the challenge will be to find a middle path, a way of integrating the revelation without losing coherence. And this is why the idea of preparation is not about stockpiling supplies or retreating to bunkers, but about cultivating psychological resilience, about learning to sit with uncertainty, about developing the capacity to revise your understanding of the world without losing your sense of self, because the self that survives revelation is not the self that clings to a fixed story, but the self that can adapt, that can hold multiple possibilities, that can tolerate not knowing. And if you are hearing this now, if you are following this thread, then you are already engaged in that work. You are already practicing the art of holding uncertainty, and that practice will serve you in January 2026, or whenever the disclosure comes. Because it is coming. The convergence of signals is too strong to ignore. The pattern is too clear, and whether it arrives in the exact month predicted or unfolds over a longer arc, the direction is set. And the question is not whether there will be revelation, but what we will do with it. How we will respond not just individually, but collectively. Whether we will use it as an opportunity to rebuild on more honest foundations, or whether we will fragment into competing realities, each clinging to its own version of truth. And this is where the warnings from Vanga and Nostradamus take on a moral dimension. Because they are not just describing what will happen, they are implicitly asking what should happen, how we should prepare, what kind of consciousness we need to cultivate to meet this moment with integrity rather than fear. And the answer is not found in any single action, but in a way of being. A quality of attention, a willingness to look directly at what is uncomfortable, to question what is familiar, to hold space for the possibility that everything you thought you understood about the world is incomplete. And this is hard work. It is the hardest work, because it requires you to dismantle your own certainties. But it is also necessary work, because the alternative is to be caught unprepared when the veil lifts, to be overwhelmed by what is revealed, rather than able to engage with it. And so we return to January, to the cold clarity of beginnings, to the month that strips away illusion and forces us to confront what is. And if January 2026 is indeed the threshold that Vanga and Nostradamus saw, then it will not be a month of endings but a month of painful births, the emergence of truths that were always there but hidden, waiting for the moment when they could no longer be denied. And the unease you may feel when you think about that date is not irrational. It is a recognition, a subtle knowing that something is shifting, that the ground beneath the agreed-upon reality is moving, and that movement is not something to fear, but something to witness, to observe with as much clarity as you can muster. Because those who can see the revelation for what it is, who can understand it as both a crisis and an opportunity, will be the ones who shape what comes after. And so this is not a warning in the traditional sense. It is an invitation to pay attention, to notice the places where the veil is already thin, to prepare yourself not with supplies but with awareness, with the mental and emotional flexibility to integrate what is revealed without losing yourself in the process. And if you have watched this far, if you have followed this thought to its conclusion, then you are already part of the pattern. You are already one of the witnesses, and I invite you to leave a comment below with your name and your city. Not as proof of anything, but as a marker, a way of acknowledging that you were here, that you heard the signal. And if this resonates with you, share it, not to spread fear, but to spread awareness. Because the more people who approach January 2026 with clarity rather than panic, the better the collective response will be. And in the end, that is what matters, not whether the revelation is extraterrestrial or political or ecological or all of the above, but whether we meet it with wisdom or with fear. And wisdom begins with the willingness to look, to see what is actually there, rather than what we wish were there. And so we close where we began. With January, with the threshold, with the quiet understanding that certain months carry more weight than others, and January 2026 may be one of those months, not because prophecy demands it, but because the pattern suggests it, because the convergence is too clear, because the veil is already thinning, and when it finally lifts, what will be revealed is not something alien, but something that was always there, waiting to be seen. And the question is whether you will be ready to see it. But let us not move too quickly to closure, because there are layers here that deserve a slower examination, a more careful unpacking of what it means when two seers, separated by so much time and circumstance, arrive at the same symbolic conclusion. And we must ask ourselves what they were actually seeing, not in the sense of clairvoyance as entertainment or as supernatural spectacle, but in the sense of pattern recognition that operates at a level deeper than conscious analysis, because both Baba Vanga and Nostradamus were living through periods of tremendous upheaval, Baba Vanga through the collapse of empires and the rise of ideological warfare, through the scars of a world war that left no corner of Europe untouched, and Nostradamus through the religious wars that tore France apart, through plague and persecution and the constant threat of being burned as a heretic. And it is precisely this experience of living on the edge of civilizational rupture that may have attuned them to the signs of future ruptures, not through magic but through a heightened sensitivity to the way systems break, to the patterns that precede collapse. And if we take this view, then their warnings about January 2026 are not supernatural predictions but extrapolations, projections based on an intuitive understanding of how tension accumulates in human systems until it reaches a breaking point. And the specific month matters, because months are not just arbitrary divisions of time, they carry psychological weight. They structure our expectations. And January in particular carries the weight of beginning, of resolution, of the moment when intentions must be translated into action. And it is this quality of January, as a forcing function, as a time when delay is no longer possible, that makes it a likely window for revelation. Because revelation is not something that happens randomly, it happens when the cost of maintaining the secret exceeds the cost of releasing it, when the energy required to keep the veil in place becomes unsustainable. And we are approaching that point now across multiple domains. You can see it in the way institutions speak, in the careful hedging, in the preemptive framing, in the slow drip of partial disclosures, designed to inoculate the public against the shock of full disclosure. And this is not conspiracy. This is simply how power operates. When it senses that the ground is shifting beneath it, it tries to manage the transition, to control the narrative, even as the narrative escapes control. And what Baba Vanga may have perceived was not the content of the revelation, but this quality of inevitability, the sense that by January 2026 the mechanisms of control would have exhausted themselves, that the system would no longer have the energy to maintain the fiction. And Nostradamus, working with astrological frameworks and symbolic correspondences, would have encoded this in his quatrains as a moment when certain planetary alignments mirrored certain psychological states, when the outer cosmos reflected the inner crisis. And whether you believe in astrology or not, the underlying insight is sound, that human consciousness is not isolated, but embedded in larger patterns, responsive to cycles that we experience but do not fully understand. And January 2026 may represent one of those moments when the cycle turns, when what was ascending begins to descend, when what was hidden begins to emerge, and the image of the sky opening that appears in Baba Vanga's visions can be read in this light, not as a literal event, but as a metaphor for the opening of perception, for the moment when what was dismissed as impossible suddenly becomes visible. And this could take many forms. It could be the disclosure of evidence that non-human intelligence has been engaging with humanity for far longer than officially acknowledged, not necessarily with malevolent intent but with purposes we have not understood. It could be the revelation of technologies that have been developed in secret and that fundamentally alter our understanding of physics, of energy, of what is possible within the constraints we thought were absolute. It could be the exposure of historical manipulations so profound that they require a complete rewriting of the narratives we have been taught, not just about recent events, but about the deep past, about the origins of civilization itself. Or it could be something more subtle and more pervasive, the recognition that consciousness itself is not what we have been told it is, that the boundary between mind and matter is not as solid as materialist science has claimed, that we are embedded in a field of awareness that extends far beyond the individual brain, and any of these revelations would be destabilizing, not because they are inherently threatening, but because they undermine the foundational assumptions on which our institutions, our economies, our sense of identity are built, and this is why the psychological preparation is so crucial. Because the revelation will not ask for your permission. It will not wait until you are ready. It will arrive when the conditions are right, and if you have not done the work of loosening your attachment to certainty, of building a self that can flex rather than shatter, then the impact will be much harder than it needs to be. And this is not fear-mongering. This is simply acknowledgement of how human psychology works. We are pattern-seeking creatures. We need coherent narratives to function. And when those narratives are suddenly revealed to be incomplete or false, the cognitive dissonance can be overwhelming. It can lead to denial, to rage, to a desperate search for simpler explanations, for scapegoats, for someone to blame. And this is where societies fracture. Not at the moment of revelation, but in the aftermath. When different groups construct different narratives to explain what has been revealed, when consensus dissolves and every interpretation becomes contested, and so the real challenge of January 2026, if it is indeed the threshold month, will not be the revelation itself, but what comes after. The question of whether we can find a shared framework for making sense of what we now know, whether we can build new institutions on more honest foundations, or whether we will spiral into fragmentation, into a war of all against all, each faction convinced of its own righteousness and unable to hear the others. And this is why the work of preparation is not individual but collective. It is not enough for you alone to be ready. The people around you need to be ready. Your community needs to be ready. And this is done not through preaching or proselytizing, but through modeling. Through demonstrating that it is possible to hold uncertainty without collapsing into fear, that it is possible to question authority without losing all sense of orientation, that it is possible to integrate disturbing information without losing compassion. And these are skills that can be practiced. They are not innate. They are learned through repeated exposure to discomfort, through the willingness to sit with what you do not understand rather than rushing to judgment. And if you have been watching the world carefully over the past few years, you have already had many opportunities to practice, because the veil has been thinning for a while now. The revelations have been coming in waves, each one slightly larger than the last, each one revealing a little more about the gap between official narrative and reality. And what seemed shocking a few years ago now seems almost quaint, almost naive, because each disclosure has prepared us for the next, has expanded our capacity to absorb information that contradicts what we thought we knew. And this is the incremental process by which collective consciousness evolves, not through sudden leaps, but through repeated confrontations with the edge of the known. And January 2026 may represent the moment when this incremental process reaches a critical mass. When the accumulated weight of partial disclosures tips over into full recognition, when the pattern that has been assembling itself piece by piece suddenly snaps into focus, and when that happens, the question will be whether we can maintain our humanity in the face of it, whether we can respond with curiosity rather than defensiveness, with compassion rather than blame, with a willingness to rebuild rather than a desire to retreat, and this is not guaranteed. History shows us that civilizations can respond to revelation in many different ways. Some use it as a catalyst for renewal, for the construction of more truthful systems, but others use it as a justification for violence, for purges, for the imposition of new orthodoxies even more rigid than the ones that were shattered. And the difference between these outcomes is not in the revelation itself, but in the consciousness of the people receiving it, in whether they have done the inner work necessary to integrate disturbing information without projecting their anxiety outward, without needing an enemy to simplify the complexity. And so again, we return to the idea that preparation is psychological. It is about building the capacity to hold paradox, to tolerate ambiguity, to remain curious even when everything you thought you knew is being called into question. And if this sounds too abstract, too detached from the concrete concerns of daily life, consider that the alternative is to be swept along by whatever narrative gains the most momentum in the chaos that follows revelation, to become a passive participant in events rather than an active shaper of them. And there is dignity in choosing the harder path, in choosing to do the work of consciousness even when it is uncomfortable, because that work is what allows you to remain grounded when everything around you is shifting. And this is what Baba Vanga and Nostradamus, in their different ways, were pointing toward. Not a specific catastrophe, but a moment of testing, a moment when humanity would be forced to choose what kind of species it wants to be, whether it wants to continue operating in the old mode of secrecy and control and fragmentation, or whether it is ready to experiment with transparency, with cooperation, with a recognition of our fundamental interdependence. And this choice cannot be made in advance. It can only be made in the moment, in the actual confrontation with revelation, but the preparation you do now will determine which choice becomes available to you, whether you will have the presence of mind to choose wisely, or whether you will react instinctively, defensively, in ways that you may later regret. And so the invitation here is not to believe anything specific about January 2026, but to use the possibility of revelation as a catalyst for doing the work you would need to do anyway, the work of becoming more conscious, more flexible, more resilient, more capable of holding complexity without collapsing into simplification. And if January 2026 comes and goes without dramatic revelation, you will not have wasted your time, because the work itself is valuable. It makes you more able to navigate whatever uncertainties arise, and if revelation does come, if the veil does lift, and something profound is disclosed, then you will be among those who can meet it with clarity rather than panic, with understanding rather than fear. And that clarity will be needed, because the period that follows revelation will be one of profound reconstruction, of renegotiating the terms on which society operates, of rebuilding trust in institutions that have been exposed as unreliable, or perhaps of building entirely new institutions that operate on different principles. And this work will require people who have not been shattered by the revelation, who can think clearly even when the old certainties are gone, who can hold space for others who are struggling to integrate what they are learning. And this is leadership not in the sense of authority, but in the sense of steadiness, of being a point of stability in a time of flux. And you can begin practicing this now, in small ways, in your daily interactions, by being the person who does not panic when others panic, who asks questions when others jump to conclusions, who holds space for multiple perspectives when others demand that everyone choose a side. And these small acts of consciousness accumulate. They build the capacity that will be needed when the stakes are higher, when the revelations are more profound, when the temptation to react rather than respond is overwhelming. And so we must also consider the specific textures of the warnings, the particular images and symbols that appear in the fragmented accounts of what Baba Vanga said and what Nostradamus wrote, because these images are not arbitrary. They are chosen for their resonance, for their capacity to carry meaning across time and context. And one image that recurs is the image of fire in the sky, not the fire of destruction, but the fire of illumination, of something that burns away obscurity and leaves only what is essential. And this could be read as a metaphor for the effect of revelation, the way it burns through pretense and leaves only truth, however uncomfortable that truth might be. And another image is that of a great city falling silent, not because it has been destroyed, but because its inhabitants have been stunned into speechlessness. And this captures something essential about the psychology of revelation, the way it produces a moment of collective shock, a pause in which the usual chatter stops, and everyone is forced to reckon with what has just been disclosed. And that moment of silence is crucial, because it is the moment when old narratives lose their grip, when the automatic responses are suspended, when there is an opening for something new to emerge. But that moment is also fragile. It can quickly be filled with reactive noise, with competing claims and counterclaims, with the rush to re-establish some kind of certainty, even if that certainty is false. And so the work of preparation includes learning to extend that moment of silence, to resist the urge to fill it immediately with interpretation, to sit with the not knowing long enough to see clearly what is actually there, rather than projecting what you expect or fear onto the situation. And this is a practice that can be cultivated in meditation, in contemplation, in any discipline that teaches you to observe your own reactivity without being controlled by it. And it is also a practice that can be cultivated in dialogue, in learning to listen deeply, to perspectives that challenge your own, in resisting the urge to dismiss or argue, and instead trying to understand what the other person is actually saying, what they are actually experiencing, and why their interpretation might be valid even if it differs from yours. And these practices may seem unrelated to the grand question of prophecy and revelation, but they are intimately connected, because the quality of consciousness you bring to the moment of revelation will determine what you are able to see and how you are able to respond. And if your consciousness is rigid, if you have not practiced flexibility, then you will see only what confirms your existing beliefs, and you will miss the larger pattern. But if your consciousness is spacious, if you have practiced holding multiple perspectives, then you will be able to see more clearly, to discern the signal from the noise, to recognize what is actually significant in the flood of information, and claim and counterclaim that will follow any major disclosure. And this discernment will be essential, because one of the challenges of revelation is that it will be accompanied by a tremendous amount of confusion, of misinformation, of deliberate attempts to muddy the waters. Because those who benefit from the old systems will not simply accept their dissolution. They will fight to maintain control of the narrative, to shape the revelation in ways that preserve their power, or at minimum to create enough doubt that consensus becomes impossible. And this means that the truth, when it emerges, will not be clean. It will be contested. It will be surrounded by lies and half-truths and distortions. And your ability to navigate this landscape will depend on your capacity for discernment, for separating what is signal from what is noise. And this capacity is not something you can develop in the moment. It must be cultivated in advance, through practice, through repeated encounters with ambiguity, through learning to trust your own perception, while also remaining humble about the limits of that perception. And if this sounds like a paradox, it is. Because wisdom always involves holding paradoxes, holding seemingly contradictory truths in tension, without trying to resolve them prematurely. And the revelation of January 2026, if it comes, will present you with many such paradoxes, moments when the truth seems to point in multiple directions at once, when the implications are both liberating and terrifying, when what you learn calls into question everything you thought you knew while also confirming suspicions you have carried for years. And the ability to hold these paradoxes without fragmenting, without choosing the comfort of false certainty over the discomfort of not knowing, is the hallmark of mature consciousness. And it is this mature consciousness that Baba Vanga and Nostradamus, in their cryptic warnings, were calling forth, not explicitly but implicitly, not through doctrine but through the challenge itself, through the act of pointing toward a moment when such consciousness would be necessary for survival, not physical survival but psychological and spiritual survival, the survival of your integrity as a conscious being in the face of information that threatens to overwhelm you. And so we must also ask what it means to survive revelation. Because survival is not simply about continuing to exist, it is about continuing to function, to engage, to contribute, to be a participant in the collective project of making sense of what has been revealed and building something better on the ruins of what has been exposed. And this requires not just individual resilience but collective solidarity, a recognition that we are all in this together, that the revelation affects everyone, and that no one can navigate it alone. And this is where community becomes essential. Not community in the sense of people who all believe the same things, but community in the sense of people who are committed to working through the implications together, who can challenge each other's interpretations without rupturing the relationship, who can hold each other accountable while also extending grace. And building this kind of community is difficult work. It requires vulnerability. It requires the willingness to be wrong, to change your mind, to admit that you do not have all the answers. And these are not qualities that our culture tends to reward. We are trained to be certain, to be right, to defend our positions at all costs. But these are exactly the qualities that will make us brittle when revelation comes, that will cause us to break rather than bend. And so part of the preparation is unlearning these habits, learning instead to value questions over answers, process over conclusions, relationship over rightness. And if you can do this, if you can build connections with others who are doing the same work, then you will have a foundation to stand on. When everything else is shaking, you will have people you can turn to, people who can help you make sense of what is happening, who can remind you of your values when the confusion threatens to overwhelm them. And this network of relationships is more valuable than any stockpile of supplies, more valuable than any ideological framework. Because relationships are flexible, they can adapt to new information in ways that rigid systems cannot. And in the aftermath of revelation, adaptability will be the most precious resource. The ability to respond to rapidly changing conditions without losing your sense of purpose, without losing your connection to what matters. And what matters is not some abstract principle but the concrete reality of other people, the web of care and responsibility that binds us to each other. And revelation, no matter how profound, cannot change that fundamental fact. It can only make it more visible, more urgent, more necessary. And so we return once more to the question of timing, to why January 2026 specifically. And the answer may be that it is not specifically January 2026, that what Baba Vanga and Nostradamus perceived was a window rather than a date, a period of heightened probability that extends from late 2025 through early 2026, during which the conditions for disclosure are maximally aligned. And within that window, January stands out, because it is the month when things begin, when the intentions formed during the darker months of winter are brought into the light of action, and there is something symbolically appropriate about revelation occurring in January, as if the cosmic calendar itself is structured around this rhythm of concealment and disclosure, of winter darkness followed by the slow return of light. And if we think of revelation not as a single event but as a process, then January 2026 may mark not the revelation itself, but the beginning of the revelation, the moment when the first clear signals break through the noise, when what was suspected becomes confirmed, when the veil begins to lift in earnest, and what follows will unfold over months or years, a gradual unveiling rather than a sudden shock. And this too is important to understand, because it means that the work of integration will be ongoing, that there will not be a single moment of crisis followed by resolution, but rather a prolonged period of adjustment, of learning to live with what we now know, of rebuilding systems and relationships and identities on more truthful foundations. And this work will be exhausting. It will require sustained attention and effort. It will test your patience and your faith. And there will be moments when you want to give up, when you want to retreat into old certainties even though you know they are false. And in those moments you will need to remember why you are doing this, why you chose awareness over ignorance, why you chose the harder path. And the answer is not because awareness is comfortable, but because it is real, because it allows you to engage with the world as it actually is, rather than as you wish it were. And there is a deep satisfaction in that, a sense of integrity that comes from facing reality directly. And that integrity is what will sustain you through the difficulties that follow revelation, that will allow you to maintain your sense of purpose, even when the external world is chaotic. And so as we move toward the close of this exploration, as we spiral back to the beginning, we must acknowledge that we have not provided definitive answers, that we have instead traced the outlines of a possibility, a convergence of warnings from two figures separated by time and culture, both pointing toward January 2026, as a moment when something long hidden will be revealed. And whether this revelation is political, technological, ontological, or some combination of all three, the underlying pattern is the same. It is the pattern of truth breaking through, of veils lifting, of light entering spaces that have been kept deliberately dark. And the human response to this will determine everything, will determine whether we use the revelation as an opportunity for growth or as an excuse for violence, whether we respond with wisdom or with fear. And that choice is not made collectively but individually. It is made by each person in the moment when they are confronted with information that challenges their understanding of reality. And the work you do now to prepare your consciousness, to build flexibility, to cultivate discernment, to deepen relationships, all of this work will influence that choice, will make it more likely that you will choose wisdom, that you will be able to see clearly and act with integrity even when everything around you is uncertain. And this is the real message embedded in the warnings of Baba Vanga and Nostradamus. Not that catastrophe is inevitable, but that consciousness is required. That the future is not fixed, but responsive to the quality of awareness we bring to it. And January 2026, whether it brings dramatic revelation or simply continues the slow process of disclosure that is already underway, represents a moment when that awareness will be tested. When we will all be asked to demonstrate whether we have done the work, whether we are ready to see what has been hidden, and to act on that seeing with courage and compassion. And so the invitation remains, not to believe any specific prophecy, but to use the possibility of revelation as a catalyst for becoming more awake, more present, more capable of holding complexity, and to build communities of others who are engaged in the same work. Because when revelation comes, and it will come, whether in January 2026 or in some other moment that the pattern dictates, those who have prepared will be the ones who can respond with clarity, who can help others navigate the confusion, who can hold steady while the world reorganizes itself around new truths. And this steadiness, this clarity, this capacity to remain human in the face of the inhuman, is the greatest gift you can offer to yourself and to the collective. And so we end where we began, with January, with the threshold, with the understanding that certain moments in history carry more weight than others, that certain months mark irrevocable transitions, and that January 2026 may be such a moment, not because prophecy demands it, but because the pattern suggests it, because two different minds, separated by centuries, converged on this symbolic warning. And whether their warnings are ultimately vindicated or remain intriguing footnotes in the history of human intuition, the work they point toward is necessary regardless. The work of building consciousness that can meet revelation without shattering. the work of preparing for a future that is more honest and therefore more difficult than the past we have known. And if you have stayed with this exploration to its conclusion, if you have followed the thread through all its twists and returns, then you are already engaged in that work. You are already part of the pattern. And I invite you once more to mark your presence, to leave your name and your city below, not as proof of anything but as a gesture of participation, as a way of saying that you were here, that you considered these possibilities, that you are willing to hold the question of revelation without rushing to premature answers. And if others you know might benefit from this reflection, share it with them, not as alarm but as inquiry, as an invitation to think together about what it means to live in a time of thinning veils, and to prepare not with fear, but with the kind of clear-eyed awareness that allows us to meet whatever comes with grace, with intelligence, with the resilience that arises from having done the work in advance. And as the days move forward toward January 2026, pay attention. Notice what emerges. Notice what is disclosed. Notice the spaces where the official narrative falters. Because these are the places where the veil is already lifting, where truth is already pressing through. And in noticing you become a witness. And in witnessing you become part of the collective process of integration, of making sense, of building meaning from what might otherwise be overwhelming chaos. And this is the real prophecy. Not that something specific will happen on a specific date, but that we are entering a period when the capacity for conscious witnessing will be tested and found either sufficient or wanting. And the choice of which outcome unfolds belongs not to fate but to each of us, to the quality of presence we can bring to each moment, to the courage we can muster to see clearly even when clarity is painful, to the compassion we can extend to ourselves and others, as we all struggle to integrate revelations that challenge everything we thought we knew about reality, about humanity, about our place in a cosmos that is far stranger and more mysterious than the stories we have been told. And so let January 2026 come. Let the veil lift if it is meant to lift. And let us meet whatever is revealed with the full measure of our humanity, with all the consciousness we have cultivated, with all the resilience we have built, with all the love we can extend even in the face of truths that might otherwise terrify us. Because love, in the end, is what allows us to remain human, is what allows us to hold the paradox of being tiny, fragile, temporary creatures in an incomprehensibly vast universe, while also being beings capable of understanding, of creating meaning, of choosing, how we respond to circumstances we did not choose. And that capacity, that essential human capacity for choice even in constrained circumstances, is what no revelation can take from us. It is what survives. Every disclosure, every upheaval, every moment when the ground shifts beneath our feet. And as long as we remember that, as long as we hold to our capacity to choose awareness over denial, compassion over fear, engagement over retreat, then we will not just survive revelation, we will be transformed by it, elevated by it, made more fully human by the necessity of rising to meet it. And this is the promise hidden in the warnings, the hope embedded in the prophecy, that January 2026, or whenever the moment arrives, will mark not an ending, but a beginning. The beginning of a more honest relationship with reality. The beginning of a more mature phase of human civilization. The beginning of the work of building a world on foundations of truth rather than convenient fiction. And that work will be difficult. It will take generations. It will require more from us than we sometimes think we can give. But it is also the work that gives life meaning, that makes the struggle worthwhile, that allows us to look back and say that we were present in a moment of transition, that we did not hide, that we did not collapse, that we stood witness and did what we could to help others stand as well. And so the script concludes, not with answers, but with questions, not with certainty, but with invitation, not with fear, but with a strange kind of hope, the hope that comes from recognizing that we are capable of more than we know, that consciousness is more flexible than we have been taught, that humanity has survived revelations before and can survive them again, not unchanged but transformed, not unscathed, but stronger for having been tested. And if January 2026 is indeed the threshold, if the warnings of Baba Vanga and Nostradamus point to something real, then let us approach it not as victims but as participants, not as passive recipients of fate, but as active shapers of our collective future. And let that shaping begin now, in this moment, with the choice to be awake, to be present, to be ready for whatever truth emerges from behind the veil.